My name is Morgan Landers, and I'm moderator for today's conversation on civilian-military relations. I'm a graduate fellow at the International House, the sponsor of today's event. The mission of International House is to enable students and scholars from around the world to learn and live together in a diverse community that builds lifelong qualities of leadership, respect, and friendship. Founded in 1932 by John D. Rockefeller, International House of Chicago is today one of 20 members of the International Houses Worldwide Network. In addition to supporting the graduate student community through our Graduate Commons program, International House also serves the greater Chicago community as a cultural and intellectual center for a wide array of programs. Close to 100 public programs are held each year at the International House through the Global Voices Performing Arts and Lecture Series. And in 2021, we have created new global focused programs, community outreach, and achievement activities that continue to foster diversity virtually through online gatherings. The Global Voices programs and lecture series includes music and cultural performances, outreach programs with Chicago area international organizations, collaboration with foreign consulates, and forums and debates led by distinguished guest speakers. Today's conversation on civilian-military relations is held in coordination with the Office for Military Affiliated Communities, OMAC. OMAC serves as a central hub for resources, support, and programming for the entire military-affiliated community. OMAC is responsible for developing and coordinating specialized programming for the university's military-affiliated community, including current and potential undergraduate, graduate, and professional studies students, alumni, faculty, staff, and all of their respective families. I recommend reaching out to OMAC to discuss potential VA and DoD benefits to assist with educational needs at the University of Chicago, and I can personally attest to this organization's professionalism and efficacy. I'm excited to present to you today's panel. We have two fantastic panelists from within the Harris School to take part in today's important discussion. First, we have Zach Crahan. He is a Master of Public Policy candidate at the Harris School in the class of 2022. Originally from a small town in Northern Ohio, he attended West Point from 2008 to 2012, where he received his Bachelor's of Science in American History. Upon graduation, he commissioned in the Army as an armor officer, deploying to Jordan in support of counter-ISIS operations. He served at Fort Benning in Georgia and Fort Bliss in El Paso. Prior to attending Harris, he worked a corporate sales job in Dallas. The personal and professional lack of fulfillment from his short time there clarified his enduring desire for public service. Since arriving at Harris, he has been active in several student organizations, including the Institute of Politics. Most notably, he is the president and founder of the Military Affiliated Students of Harris, or MASH. MASH aims to address the lack of veteran representation in public policy and politics more broadly, and provide a community for former service members and engender a greater understanding of the military and veterans issues amongst our colleagues. Our second panelist is John Schmidt. He is Master of Public Policy candidate at the Harris School in the class of 2021 and a recipient of several honors, including the International House Graduate Fellowship, the Knoll Fellowship, and the Harris Community Action Fellowship, to name a few. He attended Loyola University from 2012 to 2016, where he received a Bachelor's of Arts in Economics and International Studies, while minoring in French, Spanish, and East Asian Studies. Though he is originally from Wichita, Kansas, his professional career spans the globe. Spanning 5 years in 4 continents, John worked for the World Health Organization's East Asia office, the Quebec delegation of Chicago, the United Nations Development Program, and the World Bank's Development Impact Evaluation DIME unit. Additionally, from 2017 to 2019, John served in Senegal as a business advising extension agent for the U.S. Peace Corps. An American who speaks French, Spanish, and Wolof, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, John's work revolves around aligning incentives between our planet, its people, and their government to build a more prosperous world. I couldn't be more delighted to have both of these fine gentlemen here today on our panel. And after roughly 30 minutes, we'll have a brief Q&A session, so please submit your questions throughout at the link at the bottom of the Zoom. Without further ado, let's start hearing from our panelists.
So real quick, Morgan, before we hop into this, I should have put this in my bio, but my military affiliation is I am the son of 2 retired Army colonels. So grew up, moving around and living on base and stuff. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you for adding that necessary context. I apologize for not highlighting that earlier. So the first question that I have for both of you are, what are some of the significant obstacles that you believe separate the military community from the civilian community, and how have they affected you personally and in your family life?
Yeah, I can kick that off, and then John can provide his perspective as we call a brat. It's children of folks in the military. I think the starkest challenge and difference between the military and the civilian world, as we call it, and I think especially we're disadvantaged coming out of the academies, because I think separately than ROTC, we don't have a traditional college experience whatsoever. It's extremely structured and rigid and not really fun for most of your time there, but you make the best of it. But as I was saying, it's definitely the lack of structure. That's something I still deal with, and I think a lot of people that get out of the military deal with. And it starts with the idea of, we always have a time, place, and uniform for every event. There's always, you kind of know what needs to be done most of the time, unless you're like deployed or in the field or something and ambiguous situations arise. But even when you're deployed, there's a comfort in knowing what you're doing every single day. But yeah, along those lines, it's just a big challenge. And the example I always use when I talk about this is during our cadet basic training, our first year at West Point, the first summer at West Point, it's like what you see on TV and movies and everything. It's a little bit like boot camp or whatever. We shave our heads and have to learn how to say yes or no, sir, no excuse, sir, ma'am, whatever. At towards the tail end of it, they start orienting you to, all right, well, what's your cadet experience going to be like? Why are you even here? You're going to join the Army. What's that look like? And there's a PowerPoint slide, and it has like a little star at the bottom. It says you are here. You're about to start as a cadet your first year at West Point. And then there's a diagonal line, and then there's another little star up at the corner of the slide, and it shows, this is what a successful career looks like, and it's 24 years away, and it's after you've served as a battalion commander, which is the leader of between 400 and 600 people, and you get the full retirement benefits and everything. So there's a timeline of 24 years that you know exactly what you need to do if that is in fact your chosen path. And I think that's just a great example of, like, when we get out, a lot of times we flounder. I know that veterans spend the least amount of time in their first job, like less than a year, typically, myself included. So it's definitely a structure thing. I think is probably the biggest challenge amongst others, but the easiest one to explain is that.
I think that's exactly right. And you highlighted something there at the end that, you do this, you get your retirement, you're in for 20 plus years, and then you have a really tough time readjusting. And both of my dad and my stepmom, who, as I mentioned, are both retired colonels, definitely had that same experience. But I guess the way that I think about this question, as someone who has been, military affiliated for the vast majority of my life, but who isn't I'm not myself a service member, is one of the biggest obstacles are the things that people think that they know about the military. So, for example, I think the general perception, at least in the US and a lot of communities, is that military members are supposed to be very conservative. But when you're in it, you realize that kind of varies by rank and branch too. And as the child of an officer, I was subject to somewhat less of that conservative bias in my upbringing that a lot of people expect me to have. And especially since I'm also from Kansas, where I actually am right now, that's a particularly conservative state. So the military is small in the scheme of things. Like, I think it's 1% of the population or so. Morgan dropped that stat on me one of the times we talked. It's less than 1% of the population that's affiliated, which is much lower than in years past. So I think there's a lot of this kind of institutional memory of what the military is, where in fact now it's changed as a piece of our society. And one other thing I'll mention is talking about the civ-mil relations, right? So my little brother, when we moved from living on base in Arkansas to moving off base, when we moved to Iowa for my dad's, he changed his jobs. He didn't want to be a part of the military kids group at school. They'd gotten some extra money and they wanted to, have these military kids together to try to meet new friends and stuff because they move around so much. But he didn't want his friends at school to know that he was part of a military family because he thought that would come with a certain degree of bias in a less conservative state. So I think that people's perceptions can come at a very early age, but it definitely does depend on the community that one finds themselves in, whether or not they kind of want to lean into that affiliation or not.
Very interesting. And if I may add on to what you were saying, Zach, I had a similar experience about like the structure of the military as I was also getting out of my service. So toward the end of my time in the military, I was at Fort Polk, Louisiana. And Fort Polk, there's a large interstate that goes right next to the post, and you either go left and go towards Baton Rouge, or you go right and go towards Shreveport. So as I was getting out, I was talking to some of the other officers who were getting out. We're used to a life of rigid structure in most things. And one thing that he pressed upon me after he had left is that he didn't know whether to go left or right at that interstate when the day came for him to leave. He had packed up his house. He had worked with other people to set up his affairs for his next step after leaving Fort Polk, but there's always going to be that gap. And he really didn't know whether to go left or right. And that's easy enough for us officers to deal with, or somewhat easier when compared to the enlisted ranks, because officers are paid more, officers are come in as a requirement with a higher level of education than the requirements for an enlisted soldier. So it seemed easier for them, but then seeing some of my soldiers deal with that same lack of structure really hit them a lot harder. And even now, I still get calls from soldiers asking about help with jobs or navigating the VA. I just thought that was something that really matched what you were saying, really dovetailed well. But I'm sorry.
No, just a quick addition to that. The difference between the officer and the enlisted side, depending on where the enlisted folks are, it's dramatically different. Morgan, like we were fortunate to have very good undergrad credentials. Many enlisted people don't, and many of them come from rough areas. It's military sometimes a way out. And that's kind of getting into the next question a little bit, but it's something that's really important for the private sector to keep in mind. It's so hard to translate skills and experiences, especially if you're enlisted and did your 3 years and don't necessarily want to go to college or something like that. There's a lot of not problems necessarily, but difficulties and struggles and issues related to folks separating from the military. Excellent point.
Now, if I can just go back a little bit to John and what you were saying, you touched you spoke very eloquently about some of the expectations about the military community, particularly the officer class. And I'd ask you to expand upon it with this question: what do you wish that civilians knew about the military community, or about military life or service, that you don't think they know? And I'd really ask that I would really love for you to expand on your experiences, like going from a military community to being outside of a military community, because I'm very interested in what you'd have to say. And Zach, I ask that you answer that same question as well.
Yeah, so I think that there's just so many differences. It's hard, we'd be here for hours. It's kind of just day and night, especially moving from being on base, just completely surrounded by that community, to being in a, not only off base, not only not with that community, but in like a completely different state, and a lot of military kids and their families do this, time and time again. My dad, I think in the last 15 years, has been in 5 or 6 different places. which is even a low number compared to some of his friends. But I think the thing that I wish that civilians knew that we don't always realize is just how the military affects people's family and how it affects their marriages, especially the divorce rates among military affiliated people are much higher than the national average. And I think that so there's a lot of people who criticize the military and may have very, very valid criticisms, but I think that those families and the spouses in particular need a lot of community support, especially during these deployment times, right? So I think that, having your opinion one way or the other is perfectly fine, but I think it's important just to make sure it's directed at the right place and not, harming people who are already in kind of a tough situation. And you guys both talked about it, but the military is very hierarchical, and a lot of people are just trying to do their jobs to make sure that they're providing for their family and doing the best job they can. And exactly what Zach was talking about, one of the things that I wish people knew is the difference between enlisted and active duty kind of communities in general, and even what that distinction is, and how enlisting especially can be a really powerful force for a lot of people escaping, rough spots and making some money and getting out of communities that they don't necessarily feel like support them. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think, we're talking about a lot of the same stuff here, that there's just a lot of broad misconceptions. I'm in the middle of this discussion, and I just Googled kind of what the demographic breakdown of the military is. And looking at the Army alone, 65% Caucasian, 13% African American, 12% Hispanic. It's pretty similar to the breakdown of the country. And in fact, I believe that's a little bit more diverse in the country, as I think that there's a greater percentage of Caucasians in the US than that. So that's number one. Number two, that we are not, there's plenty of really bad stereotypes about the military. Hollywood loves to caricaturize us. And it's, I think most of us think it's funny in certain respects or whatever. Like Big Lebowski is a personal favorite movie of mine. Walter is hilariously over the top, but and sometimes I'm like, man, this is like kind of messed up too. Like they really did a lot of satire on Vietnam vets. So putting everybody in a big box of you're socially dysfunctional alcoholics, probably like white supremacist white guy, something like that. It couldn't be more wrong. Like when I was a platoon leader and I was in charge of 30 soldiers, I think I had maybe half of it was white guys. A lot of them came from California, like rough areas like Compton. I had a guy who was from one of the bad parts of Brooklyn. You name it. A lot, like the enlisted side of the house is particularly diverse. But what you see here is it becomes more of a class thing than a race thing, and that is something that I think is really the takeaway I want to get from this question. Is the public needs to be aware of who serves. And before we all rally around the flag and want to go off to war to some other place, you need to remember who's actually serving. We don't necessarily learn our lessons throughout history. And it's generally going to be poor kids, people that don't have another choice. Luckily, we're an all volunteer force, and that does a lot. But you just need to be mindful that we still have people in Afghanistan. We still have people in Iraq right now. The American public has been very fortunate to not have to face what has been going on in the Middle East for, probably close to a decade at this point, honestly. Meanwhile, when I was a freshman at West Point, President Bush gave the address about the surge to us. So we were sitting there, the outgoing president of the United States saying, hey, we're about to send 30 to 40,000 more of you over to Iraq and Afghanistan. So, just keep that in the back of your mind for the next 4 years. we went there knowing we were going to get deployed, but still, it was interesting to see the commander-in-chief say that to us right when we get there. So yeah.
And I think one last thing off of that, I think part of any healthy criticism too of any organization is, just making sure that the criticism is directed at the right place, like in productive channels. And exactly what you're talking about, Zach, like it's a very diverse, both racially and economically and geographically. It brings in a diverse set of people, and it's by its nature, the military is very hierarchical, and you do what you're directed to do. So I think that if the criticism is always good of any big organization, but it needs to be directed at the channels that are most productive, I think.
Yeah, it's going to be less, the military is a tool. All right. And this is getting into the next question a little bit, but Clausewitz has this famous quote, war is politics by other means. The only time we use the military is because diplomatic pathways have failed, or we just don't want to do it. So the military itself is inherently the military is a political tool, but the military itself is more apolitical. So when you have criticism about the military, a lot of times it's going to be the people that we have in Capitol Hill. That's a big source of a lot of the issues that we have, I think. But I'm biased probably too on that. I'll just caveat that.
That's a very interesting point that you bring up about class, Zach. So one interesting article that I read way back in 2017, while I was still at West Point, an article by Slate identified a so-called warrior caste within the United States. And the idea is that the biggest predictor of military service is not where you're from, is not necessarily like where you're from or how much you make, but if someone closely related to you was in the military. And even now you have families that for 4 or 5 generations, they can say that, oh, my grandfather was an officer or an enlisted service member, and that has just progressed down the line.
It's 100%. Sorry.
Oh, no, you're good. I understand. It's something I'm passionate about too. Do you think this trend of this familiar warrior caste or this is a good thing for the military moving forward? Or is this something that is just a natural evolution of a volunteer army? What are your thoughts? And I'd like to hear yours as well, John.
Yeah, sorry. This is just a really quick point that is 100% relevant to what you said. Secretary Gates, former Secretary of Defense, spent like 30 some years in government throughout the Pentagon, whatever, like 5 different administrations. He gave his farewell address as I think I was a junior. And that's exactly what he mentioned, was that we have a Spartan class developing within the U.S. And yeah, I think it's an issue. I kind of talked about this with the urban-rural panel, but yeah, we need some sort of program or cultural change towards public service. Like, just, it doesn't have to be the military. It needs to be something, though. We need something to reconnect most of the country to some sort of public service. And like, because yeah, we don't want this incestuous life or society of people who their grandparents serve, their mother and father serve, so they're going to serve, and it just becomes, I think, you just start getting an insular community who is detached, and I'll tell you what, it can create a lot of resentment too. So yeah, that's kind of I just 100% agree with you on that.
Yeah, 2 things on that. One, I think that the warrior caste, or whatever you want to call it, is kind of a natural byproduct of just the siloing of the military in general. As it's gotten smaller, as it's all volunteer, it's gotten smaller as a proportion of the population. And it's a very, very strong community, which I'm sure both you, Morgan, and Zach have felt. It has a really strong sense of community kind of embedded with it by design. And yeah, I think it's a natural byproduct of that, and it's hard to see what would fix it. But I think the second point, Morgan, I think that Slate article was probably exactly right, because I was thinking about my own family, and my dad is a colonel. My brother he's in ROTC right now, is about to commission. My grandpa was he's from Germany, but he like fled the Nazis, or great grandpa, I guess, but was in the German army and then had to flee the Nazis and come to the US. And
yeah, I was going to say, your grandpa was in the army.
Yeah, when he was 6 years old. Yeah, no, yeah, great grandpa. But yeah, no, it definitely it runs in the family a little bit, and people always ask me, which I think maybe is another component of it, but people used to always ask me more than now, but like, oh, so you're going to join? Does your dad want you to join? It's like, oh, my dad doesn't really want me to join, but yeah, it's definitely familial, and you see that in a lot of people.
It's very interesting that you have managed to, at least for the time being, escape the warrior caste.
Yeah, I went the Peace Corps route, so maybe I don't know what caste, the Peace caste.
Yeah, and
public service caste, certainly.
There's one of the marching cadences, Morgan, you've heard this one too, about the different branches, and you get to the Peace Corps, and it's like smoking dope, hippies, stuff like that. It's pretty funny.
I love it. Well,
I cut my hair especially for this.
Same. I feel you both. Though I know there's more we can delve into with this topic, there are a couple more topics I really want us to hit. So, branching off of John's comments on the military and its perception, how do you feel? There have been recent issues affecting the United States, both within the United States and abroad, that have caused more political or ostensibly political uses of the military, and has altered the perception of the military for some members of the civilian populace. So focusing on one of them, the church photo op from the Trump administration, how would you say political uses of the military, such as General Milley's presence at the photo shop for the Trump administration, affected public perception of the military? And what are the implications of a more political perception of the military itself?
So I've got some on that. I can start off if you don't mind, Zach. So I think there's a lot of people who give their full unconditional support to the military as kind of a gut reaction, whether or not that's good or bad. And politicizing the military, this thing that has a relatively high approval rating, and consistently so, it helps build support for a particular candidate, but at the same time kind of polarizes the institution as a whole. And there's a lot of military leaders who speak out very, very loudly against this. General Mattis, who came a couple months ago, being one of them. And you hear Trump's "my generals" comment, but making the top brass inherently political, I think is very problematic. And you can see the short-term gains and the long-term losses in that. And I think another thing that people don't really know about the military that I think feeds into this is like so at least in my experience, it didn't feel to me like a particularly political entity at the lower levels. But if you want to make general, that requires a certain amount of politicking. So the people who are in the top brass, have a certain amount of political acumen, at least within the military itself. So kind of self-selects for, your generals and stuff, kind of self-selects for people who are better at playing that game. And I think some people use it as a way to further their career, and other people hold to kind of the norms that we shouldn't politicize ourselves because we are that tool, as Zach or Morgan said.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. A couple things. One, you kind of touched on it, but there's this thing that Tom Kraz Nation and Nick, I can't remember his last name, had a podcast, Thank You for Your Service, And if anybody wasn't aware, that is a tongue-in-cheek title. That is, the public a lot of times does that. It's like, thank you for your service. And then it's a hand wringing thing. And Nick Pareso. It's like, oh, I said, thank you for your service. Now that's it. I don't have to think about it anymore. And I think that there's a lot of similarities between that and what we've seen in the last year with folks realizing some of the social issues that we have, but a lot of times will fall in line with some sort of slogan and then do nothing. Their conscience is clear because they said something or they did, the minimal amount of effort without actually caring and doing something meaningful and holding like elected representatives accountable. I think I touched on it earlier. The military is a political tool, but the military itself, like a lot of our members, aren't or try to not be. I was apolitical. I still am for the most part, as far as like parties go, but I didn't vote because Patton had a great quote related to it where it's like you're either bought or you're like biased, something like that towards like your boss. But Millie came out and said it was a mistake. We got to be careful. You can't make any political statements in uniform, period. You can't do it. I can't remember. There was something earlier this year. I think it was at a Trump rally. There were some folks in uniform there that were advocating for President Trump, and they got in huge trouble. That's right. It was in the maybe it was the Democratic National Convention long ad. They had some Army guys doing something in that ad, and it was like a huge issue. So yeah, we need to make sure that the military remains apolitical. And ultimately, there's a last story, Newburgh conspiracy. After the Revolutionary War, none of the leadership or the folks within the Continental Army had been paid for months. So all the leaders had met in Newburgh, New York, just north of West Point. It's where one of the Washington's headquarters, and they had gathered, and they were talking about throwing a coup, like staging a coup and overthrowing the Continental government and installing like generals and everything. And George Washington got in front of everybody, took off his glasses, and was like, I've grown blind and gray in my service to this country, and I won't stand for any sort of thought of military leadership. We are subservient to the folks that the people have elected, and we're all about selfless service. So I think that was just like a really powerful kind of a legend, but the Newburgh conspiracy did happen. No one knows for sure if that's what Washington said, but.
One last little thing off that. I was going to mention it earlier, but it didn't feel like it fit, but it does feel like it fits here. So my dad, I vividly remember going into his office and asking him, like, well, who does he support? Do you support President Bush? Like President Bush sent you to Iraq for 36 months. And he's like, look, it's not, and even at home, he was this way. He's like, look, that's not my place to talk about it. And I'll be very happy to express my opinions and stuff when I'm retired and out. But, I'm in, this is me speaking as him, but, I'm in this job so that everyone else can, have the loudest voice possible and make themselves heard and, push for change. But in his capacity, that's not what he felt his job was. And I think about that with some regularity.
Thank you very much for your responses. So in that question, I think both of you really touched on more of the officer perspective or the perspective of higher level leaders. And looking through the questions, people have been rightfully pointing out that our perspective as a panel is very officer driven, from the child of an officer to two former officers. And for that, I will apologize to the attendees and ensure that in the future we have a more diverse and inclusive panel. But in order to better serve the perspective of those who are not in positions of leadership, I will ask you about how do you feel about political uses of the military that don't feature higher level officers, such as the use of federal law enforcement last summer to quell protests met one concern that was brought by various advocates for, not just advocates, but many members of the civilian populace took issue with people wearing military-style uniforms and federal forces who were ostensibly tied with the military being used to quell protests, while the president was being asked to use the military itself to quell protests. How do you feel those conversations, not involving higher level leaders about just the use of the military itself, how do you think that that might have affected people's perception of the military? Is that different than General Milley's appearance with the president? Is that more destructive in people's trust for the military? What are your thoughts?
So I think the most important thing to point out is that we don't conflate the military with other federal agencies. Okay, so there's a very, very, very clear line between what I did as an active duty soldier and what National Guard people do, which is regulated by a state. The reserves are also a federal agency, but they can be used in different ways. But then there's federal law enforcement, which is completely different. But I think what you're getting at, and I think this is what a lot of people are getting at with a question like this, is the militarization of federal law enforcement and local law enforcement. And that's where I personally have an issue with that. I think a lot of it is rewind the tape back to like 2003. And everyone was afraid of another terrorist attack. And we dealt with terrorism and radicalism for a long time. And it's only recently that we were able to really beat ISIS back. But domestic terrorism is something that people are always afraid of. And that was enabled a lot of police departments to get more stuff than they ever needed or ever had. And I have an issue with that because the public people don't know that. People don't understand that. And there is a huge difference between what I was and what federal law enforcement, state law enforcement, the tactics. And I mean, that's kind of a separate discussion, but I want to point out that there is a huge difference between what I was, what the military is, and what federal law enforcement and other organizations that aren't active duty. It's like a whole legal thing. We're not even allowed to be used in the United States, period. It's illegal unless there's some sort of act of Congress or whatever to override lots and lots of laws. But yeah, we're not used in any sort of law enforcement capacity.
Yeah, I think the conflating of law enforcement and the military within kind of the public perception too leads to some of this. And I totally agree about the militarization of the police. But I knew a guy who he really wanted to join the Army or maybe the Marines, I forget which one, but he couldn't do it. He had some medical issues. He's like, all right, well, I'm going to join the police. That's the next best thing. Because he was thinking, well, I want to be like, in the full body armor. Like I still want to have access to those same resources. And that was his own choice. But I think that when these two things are conflated so much in public perception that people make a lot of links between the two that I think they're very distinct and are intended to be very distinct. The one thing I was going to say on this really short was speaking of the guardsmen. I have a good friend of mine who's a very progressive guy, but he's a Minnesota guardsman, and he was called in in the wake of the George Floyd protests there. And I think, those guardsmen, especially, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking to earlier, they're just seen as like this other extension of the state, right? But things are a lot more complex than they may seem from the outset. And I think using federal law enforcement and the military in particular creates a lot of optics problems. And while it may very well be true that there's some instances where the military or federal law enforcement might be in a better place to respond, it's certainly a trade-off in terms of public sentiment, and one that's pretty skewed one way, I think.
Thank you for your responses on that. I think that that's an important particularly the issue of civil relations as it relates to perception of the military, of federal forces versus the military. That's a conversation that I saw popping up and asked to me personally as at that point still an officer, with people asking like, what was happening, what did this mean? And I'm glad that both of you can chime in to try and dispel some of the more pernicious rumors. So one of you had mentioned, one thing that I also wanted to bring up is a new response to an old problem in the military. The insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th brought to the forefront of the national consciousness the issue of extremism within the military, because many people who were at that event were members of military units, both active federal forces and in the National Guard. So with that in mind, do you have any experiences with extremism stemming from military members, whether that be left-wing or right-wing extremism? And if so, did these experiences affect you and your perception, or in what you think, and what your perception of those currently in uniform?
So I'll say something really quick, because I know we want to get to Q&A too, but this is maybe too personal of a story, or too unique to me. But being from Kansas, I see a lot of trucks and cars and stuff with bumper stickers that kind of espouse not extremist views, but extremer views, like, don't like America, leave, or something like that, along with stickers right next to them that are about the military, proud mom of a Marine, or what have you. And while that's not very many people, I think it's very noticeable. And there's a couple other people that I can think of, one of which I know, drives around with a big Confederate flag waving from a pole on the back of his truck, and also has a, military sticker on the back. And I think that it's something that really sticks in people's heads. And even in the instances where it's not really has no malintent attached to it, it's an optics problem for a lot of people. And yeah, I just think it's a difficult way to digest for a lot of people, like for the general population. And in such a polarized time, it's very easy to paint with a broad brush.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You see veiled, I don't think white supremacist iconography on bases. I mean, you can't have Confederate flag on anything on bases anymore. But it's also Kansas. We're not in Kansas anymore. But it's a regional thing too. And I think that a lot of times goes back to where a lot of people come from that join the military. But as far as like extremism experience in the military, I'm a straight white guy, so it's harder, I think, for me to feel like that is something that exists. I'm not going to be as perceptive to it. I do know one guy who's not in the Army anymore, he is a self-espoused like alt-right guy. But here's I think something that there's a theme in what I'm talking about, and it's holding our elected representatives accountable, because we have no recourse. We can't protest. We can't do any of that. It's the public that puts folks in office that, there's a reason the founding fathers had such an issue with a large standing military. I mean, countless documents exist about this. That was the reason we had a hard time in the War of 1812 at first, because we had to bring everything back. It happens after World War I. It's the same thing. We had to mobilize. Leading up to World War I, we had to mobilize. So we just got to a point where we just kind of keep this big ready force, and then the government tends to use us for, I don't know, like 20-year wars and invading countries that on bad intel for reasons that didn't exist, destabilizing the region. I know I'm getting political at this point, but all the same, I think having the military culture exist and the wars go on for so long, certain things have seeped into the public and have sort of allowed things to happen and folks to conflate the military with police. And some of these far right ideologies, I think, have sort of grown out of some of these things that have been happening for the last 20 years. And it doesn't help what 9/11, where the guys came from. I think that was a big part of it too. Yeah, there's a lot of things. I personally haven't seen any extremism, but like I said, I'm not somebody who would be subjugated to it.
And we come from a pretty siloed piece of the military too, which we kind of touched on earlier. It's hard to see outside the silo sometimes too, and see within.
Thank you very much for both of your perspectives. Before we turn to the Q&A, I just wanted to pitch in with my own anecdote. Though this story the story in totality is far too personal for this forum, I have myself, during my relatively short career in Fort Polk, had my experiences with personally avowed white supremacists. Some are still in the Army, some are not. And one thing that I've seen in the current administration under retired General Austin is the turn towards like really aggressively finding cases of extremists within the military as a new institutional imperative. And that is one, and I'm glad that we were able to talk about this just from a personal perspective in this civ-mil relation conversation, because I think that is something that the public should be more aware of. The same problems that the public at large deal with are also dealt with in different ways to varying degrees in the military. So on that cheerful note, we will turn towards our question and answer portion. The first question will be answered by Mr. Terrell Odom from the Office for Military Affiliated Community. Terrell, you have the floor.
Thanks, Morgan, and thanks, John and Zach. You guys did a phenomenal job. I wanted to address the first question. I believe it came from Jay Hoffman, where he speaks about the current transition process and how do we think we could bridge this gap in regard to service members having difficulties transitioning. As a researcher and as a veteran advocate, we've been doing this for over 16 years now. When you think about transition, everybody's transition is different. We have service members and veterans who are transitioning with service-connected injuries, some with families, some without, some with wartime, some not during wartime, etc. So the Department of Defense is where it all starts. Many of the people in the civilian sector have been, for the sake of better terms, picking up a lot of the slack where the Department of Defense has left off. The Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, etc., they're in the business of winning wars, not into transitioning people back into civilian lifestyle. With that said, they have been doing a much better job in creating better programming to effectively transition you out of service. Programs such as the Skills Bridge program, which allows an individual to transition up to 6 months earlier than their ETS date. So you actually move into the civilian sector, get acclimated, and get better acquainted with how the civilian structure is versus you going through, your terminal leave while you're still on post, trying to figure out where you're going to live, where you're going to work, things for your family, etc. So the Department of Defense, the VA, and all the other MOU partners and public-private industry as well have been making a better push at creating more effective transitioning programs. And I think the other parts of that question is, again, how do we retrain service members to acclimate to the civilian culture and expectations? I think that revolves more so around earlier access to the service members. So again, think about your transition when you went to higher education or a veteran when a service member went to an employer. Many of the times, your first interaction is once you get to that destination. We would like to have more earlier access to you so that we can get you acquainted with whatever services you're going to need, whatever type of support you're going to need for your family as you make that transition out of military life, not just once you've reached the civilian sector.
And I think off of that, just really quick, and thank you again, Terrell, for being here. It's good to see you. Wendy said in the chat, there's kind of questions all over in the chat and in the Q&A, but Wendy made a point in there. She said, I think what's happening is that many veterans join law enforcement when they transition out because they're looking for a more structured military-like setting. I think that's a really good point off the transition piece, but.
Absolutely. You know, when I served, again, this is predates a lot of these great programs, Warrior Scholar Project, the SVA chapters, etc. Many veterans had that in mind as they were transitioning out as, hey, I'm just going to go join the police department because my years keep rolling over. It was police, fire, and the post office. And many of them have made that transition into those spaces. And as Wendy has put it, that structure has become more militarized than what it should be inside of some of those agencies. So I wholly agree with you on that one, Wendy.
Thank you for the both of you for chiming in on that question. The next question comes from a representative of the Ukrainian Union of LGBT military members and veterans. He's asking about the experience about LGBT members of the military. So up until 2014, the law of the land was don't ask, don't tell regarding one's sexual orientation. The ultimate result of that was that a lot of members of the LGBTQ community in the military were kicked out at the point when other people began to know about their sexual orientation. So you could be a well-performing service member and doing your job to the best of your ability at the highest level, but at the point when someone found out that you had a boyfriend or a girlfriend or were homosexual or bisexual, then you could be separated from the military, sometimes under less than honorable conditions. Because of that, I have known many people personally who were lieutenant colonels and were officially on the promotion list, who were then unceremoniously kicked out of the military. Thankfully, that law changed in 2014 under the Obama administration. Since then, for lesbian, gay, and bisexual members of the military community, they are service members as much as anyone else is a service member, and they are welcomed within the military community. As a straight cishet male, I have not been able to experience the ostracization that members of this community might still face. But as a leader of a platoon of soldiers who also regularly work with other platoon leaders, I was not a witness to systemic abuse of LGBT soldiers, however, LGB soldiers, but transgender soldiers have been in a state of limbo over the last few years, including a waning ban on transgender members of the military that was disbanded under the Obama administration, then reimposed under the Trump administration. And I believe it has been done, that ban on transgender service has been done away with under the Biden administration as of right now, but it's very much a state of ever waning limbo over the past 5 to 7 years. And I hope yep.
So I was just going to say, Wendy just said something in the chat that has also been my perception of it, is that the military culture is changing, and being LGBT is more accepted now than it used to be, as you were saying, but it depends a little bit on the branch too, as many things do.
Yeah, I'll chime in on this. Not to correct you, Morgan. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed in 2010. All branches of service were opened to, or all branches within the military were open to women and transgender folks in 2014, 2015. So I think you just kind of got that timeline a little bit different. So if you've read my student profile, I mentioned how the military has as much been about national defense as it's been a social change agent. The military has typically been ahead of the rest of the country and in like the laws of the rest of the country by several years. The gay marriage was legalized in the US in, I believe, 2015. So we beat that by like 4 or 5 years. We desegregated decades before the Civil Rights Act. Now, an actual execution and implementation has not been perfect. But it is, in a way, I think we're kind of a catalyst a lot of times for a lot of these things. I'm not giving the military too much credit here because of the issues with implementing a lot of these policies, but at the same time, it's we're kind of a laboratory for that kind of stuff too, because we can't really say anything yes or no about it. We just have to say Roger and drive on. So yeah, I don't know. Like Morgan, I can't speak from personal experience because I'm not one of those demographics, but at the same time, at least they were trying, and we're working towards a more inclusive military and standardized, objective standardized requirements, which really part of the issue is over like 2/3 of the country is ineligible for service for various reasons, typically related to not being in proper physical condition. So we need to kind of focus on that a bit too.
Okay, thank you very much, Zach, John, for chiming in on that question. Sadly, though there are other questions submitted, we are reaching the end of our allotted time, and wanted to end on time to be respectful of all of our attendees. I wanted to thank every one of our panelists, Zach, John, as well as Terrell as well. I also wanted to thank our sponsors, the International House and OMAC for their support and help in getting this off the ground. And lastly, and most importantly, I wanted to thank all of our attendees for showing up, taking time out of your day to join us in our conversation, for giving us your questions and being active participants in this journey with us. So thank you all very much. These are my closing remarks, and I thank you for all of your support and help.
And we're glad to see so much interest in this. It definitely we'll definitely be doing things in the future too.
Yes, quick plug for MASH. This is a huge component to why I founded MASH, was engendering greater familiarity amongst our colleagues about veteran military related issues. So I appreciate iHouse tremendously for hosting this, Morgan for including me in this panel, and look forward to many more conversations in the future related to this.